Hello everyone, today I will explain you all about the different workflows to sculpt in Blender 2.9. So first we'll talk about the Dyntopo. So I will go into sculpt mode and activate here on the top right corner Dyntopo. So Dyntopo allows us to sculpt without worrying about the topology of our mesh. If I activate right now our wireframe, you will see that our mesh is tessellated live at the same time that we sculpt. So there are different methods in the Dyntopo workflow. If we open the panel, we have different methods of refining: subdivide collapse, only subdivide edges, or collapse edges. So the one I prefer the most is subdivide collapse, which will, if the resolution of our brush that we have established here, it's the detail size in pixels. So if I zoom out and I sculpt, it collapses the mesh, and if I zoom in and do very tiny details, it will subdivide accordingly the mesh. So I can sculpt very fine details or remove them if I zoom out. The advantages of this method, Dyntopo, is that we can work freely. So we don't need to worry about the topology of our mesh. But there are some disadvantages to this workflow. The first one is that Dyntopo performs very poorly compared to the Voxel Remesh and Multiresolution workflow. So this method can be quite slow when the mesh gets too dense. So one way to avoid this is, if our poly count gets too high, we can decimate our object, going into the modifier panel and adding a decimate modifier, and this would reduce the poly count of our object. Another disadvantage to this method is that sometimes it creates some artifacts, some non-manifold mesh, or some artifacts with the mesh, that this could be cleaned out using the Voxel Remesh and then using Dyntopo again. So this is really good. Now I will show you in combination, for example, with the snake hook brush. Then I can pull out forms completely freely. If you see, if I need, for example, a tail, I can mask, pressing M, mask a part of the mesh, Control I to invert the mask, and then use the snake hook brush to add a tail to this character very quickly, for example. Then with Dyntopo, there's a brush that it's quite useful. If we go down below here, this one, it's called Simplify, but what really does, let me activate wireframe again, the overlay. If you see now the faces, it's basically, it tessellates to the level of detail that we have established under the Dyntopo tab. So right now, for example, it's subdividing the mesh, it's adding more details. If I zoom out, then it will remove detail. So this is quite useful if you want, for example, to add detail in one zone. You can use this to add more detail, then use another regular brush, and if you want to have better performance, you can deactivate Dyntopo and then use this mesh without Dyntopo, but where there's more density in your mesh, so you can have greater detail. So these are the main advantages. Next way to work, it's using the Voxel Remesh. This way works as it follows. If we press Shift R, it will appear a grid that will determine the detail size of our faces. So if I do it bigger, they will be lower, or if I do it lower, they will be smaller, so we will have more details. So if I select my detail size on the grid and then I press Ctrl R, this will voxel remesh my object. So now if I activate wireframe, you see the faces in my object are the same size of the grid I selected before. So if we go to the remesh panel, you will see there are several options. Fixed poles. If we select this and we press Ctrl R again, you will see that it got rid of most of the poles in the mesh, so it will create a more friendly topology to sculpt, but at the same time it will be slower, the process of remeshing. So the next thing under the remesh is smooth normals. It will smooth the normals of our object, and we can activate preserve volume, or if we want to preserve the mask, if we have a mask in our object, for example like this. If I draw a mask and then I enable paint mask and I remesh, it will preserve the mask I painted. The other thing is facets. If I select the facet brush and then I draw a facet, for example, and I have this enabled, if I remesh again, it will retain the form of the facet I draw. So these are the options for the remesh brush, and this is the voxel size that we can control pressing Shift R, and then we can control the size of our mesh. So this method it's very good, especially in the beginning phases of our sculpt, because we can work as the following way. If we go into object mode, and we select different primitives, like for example, I select a UV sphere, and then I add a cylinder, and I put it here, I scale it, I apply all the transformations, select both, Ctrl J to join the objects, and then I go into sculpt mode and remesh the object. It will join the meshes. So this is very good, especially for example if I want to make an object made out of different primitives. Like if I go back and then I select this sphere and I want to edit it, let's say I want to sculpt a mushroom, for example, I can adjust these forms and then I can join the meshes, Ctrl J, go into sculpt mode, remesh those, and then it's an object that it's made of these primitives, and then I can sculpt on top of it. The other advantage of Voxel Remesh is that it performs the best in Blender. So the performance in Blender it's at its best without sculpting the mesh as it is, without subdividing it. One of the other advantages of this one is that we have freedom of form. So for example, we are not bound by the mesh. So if I stretch it a lot, the mesh, then I can remesh it again without a problem. So This is one of the other advantages of Voxel Remesh. The disadvantages is if we want to have very fine details, only if one of the locations of our object, you will see now that it will apply a very dense mesh to all of our object. So I cannot apply detail on one of our in a specific area, but I could always go to Dyntopo and add detail in specific zones if I wanted. But this I could not do it with Voxel Remesh. I would have a very dense mesh everywhere. So that would be the main thing with Voxel Remesh. The next workflow is Multires. This works as it follows. If we have, for example, a mesh that it's made of quads, I'm going to remesh using instead of Voxel Remesh, the quadriflow remesh of Blender. I will try to remesh this object. So now that the object is remeshed, I will apply a multi-res modifier, and then I will subdivide 3 times, and then with page down we go down in our subdivision level, and with page up we go up. So one of the advantages of multi-res is, as I will show you now, is that I can add fine details in a higher subdivision level, and then because we have different levels of subdivision, I can go back to a lower subdivision level and make modifications to our mesh in a lower subdivision level, and then modify it, preserving the detail that we have in higher subdivision levels. For example, I could adjust with the grab brush this mushroom, make it more asymmetric, and then go back to the highest subdivision level, and then the detail would be preserved. So this, compared to Voxel Remesh, it's a very nice thing, because then we can modify the lower subdivision level without losing the detail that we work. So if I want to work in lower subdivision levels, I can modify the shape and primary and secondary shapes without losing my detail. With the disadvantage of Voxel Remesh, it's that once we are in a higher level of subdivision, not subdivision but detail, then it's more destructive. This way it's less destructive, because now, for example, if I want to use the clay buildup, the clay strips, for example, if I want to use the clay strips, I'm removing the detail. But if instead of doing this I go back to the lowest subdivision level, I can still use the clay buildup to modify my form, and then smooth it, go back to the highest subdivision level, and the detail I made before, it's still intact. So these are the main advantages of multi-res, and also it performs quite well, similar to the performance of the workflow using the Voxel Remesh. The disadvantage of multi-res is that once you've created a quite based topology, kind of, using the remesh or retopologizing manually, then you are bound to this base mesh. So if I want to make like strong changes of form, then the mesh will stretch. So if I activate the wireframe so you can see better, then you'll see that I'm more bound to the original shape of the object. I don't have the freedom of form that I have with Dyntopo or Voxel Remesh. The good thing is I can always, if it's not manually retopologized. If I use the quad remesh and I have this, I can always apply the highest subdivision level without losing detail, and then go back to using the Voxel Remesh, but I lose the flexibility that I have with the multi-res modifier, because if I go to sculpt mode now and I make large changes to the form, I lose the flexibility I had before with the detail. So the usual workflow I would use is start with primitive forms like I used before, then use Voxel Remesh, and once I have like my primary and secondary forms, I usually would use a quad remesh, and then I would use the multi-res modifier and work with subdivision levels and to refine the shapes and add detail to the mesh. So that would be the process of working with sculpting in Blender. If you have any questions, put them down below. In the description box, I will put the main pros and cons of the different workflows of sculpting in Blender. And I hope you find the video informative and that you like it. See you next time.